Hey y'all, Melissa here with you today, and today's project is this cozy cocoon blanket style cardigan that I'm wearing. This is a super easy project. There's only 2 seams and 1 piece of fabric used to make it. And the one that I've got on the mannequin is actually the exact same as the one I'm wearing. The only difference is the fabric. So this one is made out of fleece, and the one I'm wearing is made from a blanket that I bought at IKEA. This one's going to take you under 20 minutes. This one's going to take a lot longer because of the edge finishing that has to be done. So I will see you after the introduction and show you exactly how to make both of these. Let's start with the easier of these two to construct. As you can see, I just have a big rectangle of fleece. Now I will tell you, this is not stretch fleece, but these are more comfortable to wear if your fleece does have some stretch. So if you have a choice, get the one with some stretch. Now to determine how wide and how tall I made this, first you're going to want to measure your hips. You want to divide that number by 3 and round it off, so that you have a whole number, and then add 28 to 32 inches to that, depending on how long you want the sleeves. Make sure that your total measurement isn't longer than you are tall. Otherwise, you're going to have sleeves that like fall off the ends of your arms, and it's not going to be comfortable. So I've gone ahead and I've cut mine to have the additional 28 inches in width, and then 1/3 of my hip measurement. And in height, you want to be somewhere between 30 to 36 inches, depending on how long you want this to be and how tall you are. So as a reference, I'm 5'3" and I've cut mine 30 inches in height. Once you have your fabric cut out, you want to fold it in half, matching those long edges. And then we're going to make a mark on the fabric over here. Make sure when you're folding that you're folding right sides together if your fabric has a right and wrong side. And then I'm going to use my ruler and my chalk here to mark down 6 inches. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew a seam right there and stop at 6 inches. So just clip that together so that I will remember. It's going to be important to back stitch at the beginning and the end of this seam because we're only sewing that 6 inches there. Make the same mark on the other side of your fabric as well. And then take this on over to the machine and sew those seams. Okay, I have sewn those seams. Used a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but you don't even need a sewing machine for this necessarily. You could totally hand stitch this. And I went ahead and backstitched at the beginning and at the end. And now if you turn the fabric right side out, you'll see how this works. What you created were the sleeve, the armholes. So the whole project folds up kind of like this. And then you can put it on. You're done, especially because fleece does not fray, so you don't have to worry about hemming any of those openings. So there we go. The arms go through those, and you've got that sewn. Let's look at the second version of that same shrug. Now this is constructed in basically the same way, but because I'm using a knit blanket this time to construct my shrug, we have to take a little bit of extra care when I cut this down to size. So this blanket is from IKEA, and I can make 2 shrugs out of 1 blanket, which made it a little more cost effective. Plus it's this soft chunky knit that I couldn't find in stores. Now because it is that chunkier knit, we have to take a little bit of care to make sure things don't unravel. So you're going to want to have a crochet hook to do this, and it's also a good idea to have some contrasting thread. Now first I'm going to show you how I cut this. It's vertical in the frame, but this is actually a horizontal cut. The knit stitches on this fabric have been formed by looping thread this way and then coming back that way, and so on and so forth. If you look really closely, you can see these, like this is a column of knit stitches there. So this is vertical, this is horizontal, and we need to first cut this fabric horizontally. To do that, just to mark and make sure I know exactly where I'm cutting and I'm going to be accurate, I want to take some contrasting thread and a big tapestry needle here. And you see how this one has these raised rows? That's because this particular stitch is called a garter stitch. If you don't have those raised rows, if your knit fabric just looks like those columns of knit stitches on the front and only raised rows like that on the back, that's a different kind of stitch called the stockinette stitch. You can use that too. The principle is going to be the same. What you want to do is go under one column of those stitches, which is 2 threads, over the next 2 threads, under, over, and so on. And what you're forming here is basically a slip stitch through the fabric. And the reason I do this is because it's going to help me see visually where I want to cut and make sure that I'm cutting this straight, because I'm going to need those loops to get finished back off. So do that all the way across your blanket. Another hint to figure out which way is vertical and which way is horizontal. Most blankets are going to have less width horizontally than they are vertically. So if your blanket, like this one, is a rectangle, usually the shorter side is the horizontal side. Of course, if you're using regular knit, sweater knit fabric to do this, you can skip all of these steps because that is knitted in a smaller needle so that you're not going to have the fraying that you have that I'm going to deal with here. Alright, so I've gone ahead and you can see I've got 2 lines, and that's because I'm going to cut 2 30-inch shrugs, but I'm going to cut close to this line first. So it's a little bit nerve-wracking if you've ever been a knitter to cut the knitted fabric, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut that row of loops right next to the one that I put my thread through. Okay, I've cut it all the way across, and now I want to handle this very carefully until I get that edge refinished off. So I'm going back to one end here, and what you'll see is I've got all of these little tiny pieces of yarn where I cut, and then if I carefully dislodge those, so you see that was a whole loop that just pulled out there, then what I should find is there will be a loop on the end. So here's my loop on the end. I want to stick my crochet needle through that, and then I want to find the next loop by dislodging the little yarn pieces. Okay, see the next loop right here? I want to take that and I want to pull it through my previous loop. And then I'm going to go to the next little speck of yarn that is sticking out there. And I've got another loop. So sticking my crochet needle through that and pulling it through the one that's on my needle. What will happen as I start to do this is you're noticing my contrasting yarn is starting to come out. And that's exactly what we want. And you can also see how I'm creating like a chain stitch to finish off this edge so it's not all unravelly with little bits of yarn sticking out of it. You want to go slowly and only get one loop at a time so that you can immediately finish it back in. Okay, so continue that all the way along the edge to finish up that edge. Okay, so I'm almost all the way across the piece that I cut here, and I just want to show you this thread here. That's marking where I'm going to cut off the excess of the blanket so that it's not wider than I want. And so I'm only going to continue my little crochet border to that thread. And then I'll show you how I marked that and as we cut it next. All right, so here's the last loop that I want to be worried about for the border here. And just to make sure that this loop doesn't close up or go anywhere, I'm going to put my scrap yarn through it for now and just tie a loose little knot to secure that I can untie later. Okay, to cut this vertically, I've gone ahead and I have, you see how there's just little downward facing bumps or upward facing bumps? I've run my needle through one row of all the downward facing bumps, and that's how I've gotten this yarn marker here that I can see. Before I cut though, I am going to need my sewing machine here. I'm going to sew right next to, through that line of bumps, right next to my thread, and I'm going to stitch that on the sewing machine just to help secure this a little more. Because when you cut vertically on knitting, when you're cutting down one of those rows of columns, you're actually creating a whole bunch of different short pieces of yarn instead of, you know, once we picked up the loops up here, that was actually one continuous piece of yarn that we were looping into one into the other once we pulled out these little things. When you cut vertically, all you're going to get are a bunch of short pieces of yarn where it would pull out one row if you pulled out across. So that's why we're going to go ahead and stitch before we cut this. Okay, I'm using matching thread and I'm using a pretty short 2mm stitch length to stitch down here. Okay, now that I've sewn that line of stitching next to my thread that marks the end of where I want the fabric to end, I'm going to go ahead and move like one row over and cut vertically through this column. Okay, and then to make sure this edge gets finished, because you can see there's little pieces of thread coming out the end here, I'm going to fold this over and I'm going to stitch it again right on the edge. Okay, I'm still using coordinating thread, and essentially this is just stitching right next to the row I already stitched. Okay, down here at the end, this is my last little loop from where we finished the other cut edge, and I'm going to want to make sure that gets stitched down but without the string in it. So I'm just being really careful to make sure that loop gets some stitches through it. And then I'm actually going to back stitch just to make sure it's really secure. So all that prep work to get clean edges is the part of this that takes a long time. Now that I've got those edges all stitched down, any of this extra little pieces of thread, of yarn, I can kind of just trim those off. And then my marker yarn, this green yarn that I was using to mark where I wanted to cut, can pull that right out. And then I have the correct size piece to just go ahead and fold it in half, just like we did with the fleece piece. And I'm going to stitch 6 inches down on this edge, just like I did with the fleece piece, and 6 inches on the opposite edge. Now, you could go ahead like we did the first time and use the machine to stitch this up, but since it's knit fabric and I've been taking all that time to finish the edges, I went ahead and unraveled some of the thread from where I made that horizontal cut across the blanket, and I'm going to use a blind stitch to stitch this up. So I'm going to put my edges, like butt them together like that, and it's actually going to be easier for me to do it this way. Okay, so what you want to do with your thread is you're going to come up and go ahead and tie your tail around that first stitch, and then you'll use a needle or a crochet hook later to weave that in so that it's not just hanging out there. Okay, once I've got it on that side, I'm going to come up through the opposite side, and then I'm going to go under 2 stitches on one side, and then go back to the other side and go under 2 stitches, and then just keep repeating back and forth. And when you pull those together, when you pull that thread tight, you'll see how it seams that, and it almost looks like there isn't any stitching there at all. Okay, once I'm done stitching, pull it tight, and then make sure to stretch it back out. And I'm going to take the yarn to the wrong side of this seam now. And I'm going to weave it in a few stitches and knot it before I cut it. This end up here that we knotted, I'm going to use my crochet hook. And I'm going to weave that in so you can't see the end hanging out. There we go. I just need to repeat that on the other side now. So once you've finished sewing up your sleeves, this is what the blanket shrug looks like. And to compare it on a few different bodies, here it is on me. You can see it drapes much more than the fleece one. And here is the same size shrug on my assistant Susan. So one size fits most, it just fits differently.